Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I have been doing live streams about various Christian topics, and especially about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. And today is part 7 of the series that is called The Biblical Flood. So let's go ahead and get started. The title of part 7 is The Forced Dispersion of the Adamic Line. Last week we covered Genesis chapters 6 through 8, and in chapter 6 I created an interpretive translation that regionalized the otherwise universally translated words, and I also inserted parenthetical notations for this idea that I've been coming up with and describing, which I guess you could call it the Adamic lens. Doesn't really flow off the tongue now, does it? But that's one way of calling it. Let's see, in chapter 7 of Genesis, then, I explained how the second animal manifest. Remember, first he talks about pairs of animals, and then he talks about pairs of seven pairs of animals, as well as another set of pairs of animals. In some ways it looks like he's giving a second set, but what I described was that the second animal manifest was a separate list of domesticated farm animals for use during the flood while they were on the ark, and then also afterwards as farm animals. In chapter 7, that focuses on the first 150 days of the flood. It says that the water rose in the first 40 days because of the rain that was falling both day and night, as well as the waters of the earth that burst forth from springs. And earlier on in parts, I think it was 4 and 5, we talked about how that could be the original springs of Eden, the original springs that watered the Garden of Eden. And then it talks about how the waters remained for another 110 days. So it wasn't raining, and it doesn't say anything about the springs. It does say that they went for 40 days, but it doesn't say anything about more of the springs in those 110 days. So it appears as though God supernaturally kept his hands around this flood. It was a pretty large region. I don't know how many, square miles or whatever. Nevertheless, the water would have, unless it was being replenished, it would have dispersed very, very rapidly within less than a day. So in order for it to stay as just water that the ark is floating on, it has to have been somehow supernaturally contained. That's the first 150 days of the flood. And then chapter 8 gives the timing of the second half of the flood, where the waters receded. Specifically, it says in the second month, 17th day, when Noah was 600 years old, that is when they entered the ark, and God sealed the door from the outside. Then it says in chapter 8 that in the 7th month, the 17th day, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So not Mount Ararat necessarily, but the mountains of Ararat, which is this region of what's now modern day Turkey. Then it says in the 10th month on the first day that the mountaintops appear, and then after 40 more days, Noah opens this window that God had told him to create on the top of the ark. And first he sends a raven out, and then a dove is sent out 3 different times with 7 days in between. And the first time the dove returns empty, I don't want to say empty-handed, but empty-beaked. And then the second time the dove returns with a freshly plucked olive leaf. And I talked last week about how this leaf signals restoration and a renewed life, and that many of the ancient Jews considered the olive tree was thought to be the tree of life. That could connect this idea that the flood needed to destroy the Adamic line, except for Noah and his family, who found favor in God's eyes, and also needed to destroy the Garden of Eden with its 2 special trees, but also to save some of the animals, special animals that were found in the garden still. The first month, the first day of Noah's 601st year, it says that the ground was drying. And then in the second month, the 27th day, the earth is dry enough to leave the ark. If you add all that up, and you actually can just look at this first bullet, which starts in the second month, 17th day, and it goes until the second month, the 27th day, that would be a year and 10 days from when they entered and then they exited the ark. Now, I should say that I redid the slides that I had done for Genesis chapter 6 last week because some of the, I just could say some of it I didn't like after I revisited it. And so I redid those, and those you can find in the outline, which, as always, for all these different series is on my website, thewitheredfigtree.com, and you can follow the various links to get to the Biblical Flood series, and then you'll see where it has the outline, and the outline is a PDF file. So what I did here is I was more consistent about how I translated these words from universal to local. Remember, the underlying Hebrew words can be either. And so one way or another, when you translate them, you are doing something that is interpretive. And because of the existing ideas that the flood went over the entire earth and destroyed all of mankind and all animals, when theologians and translators translate these words, they normally use, or they always use, universal words like the whole earth or all humanity. But those words actually could be just as easily translated regionally. You can see here, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth. Here I just say, when the humans began to increase in number. And then in other places where it would say the whole earth, I would just say the region, something like that. Whenever you see a italicized word, that means it's something that is different from the normal translation. This is the NIV over here on the right. This is something that I've inserted, though. If it's in the square brackets, it's a interpretive insertion to try to emphasize this Adamic, Edenic lens. So when the ordinary humans began to increase in number in the regions outside the garden, and daughters were born to them, the Adamic sons saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married anyone they chose. What I try to do is clean this up and be consistent with this type of notation of italics, and then also with the use of the square brackets. All right, so today we're going to cover Genesis chapters 9 through 11, and so let's go ahead and begin with that. We have this slide, Genesis, the first part of Genesis 9 is God's covenant with Noah. Verse 1, it says, "Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth.'" It's the same command that God had given Adam and Eve, but now, a lot has happened. A lot has happened since then. They've been kicked out of the garden, and now the garden is destroyed. And so now he's saying you can be fruitful, still be fruitful, and increase in number and fill the earth. So this is the original mandate that was given to humanity. So in a lot of ways, you can see this as the second covenant with the Adamic line. So the first covenant being the covenant of the garden, where they can eat from one tree or all the trees, including the special tree of life, but not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you do eat from it, then you will die. Of course, they did eat from it, and so they were kicked out of the garden. And so that was the first covenant with man. And since through this lens, it's not just all of humanity. It talks about how they were humans, ordinary humans outside the garden, perhaps predating the garden by millennia. And so the command specifically is to the Adamic line, the descendants of Adam and Eve. So this indicates that the Adamic line is now beginning anew with Noah and his family after the flood. Now he also gives this new relationship with animals, that the animals will now fear humans, and that every living creature is placed under the human authority, which suggests a changed post-flood world. Now, the other part of this theory idea that I've been coming up with is that the animals of the garden were special, that maybe they could all talk, We know that the serpent could be deceitful and that they were capable of being suitable helpers to Adam, but not quite suitable, just possibly candidates of being suitable. That's why God created Eve. So what happened with them? That's actually an interesting question, because the Bible doesn't say anything about what happens to the animals that were on the ark, other than if you believe that they were representatives of all animals. If it was a global flood, then you would assume that these pairs of animals return to wherever it is that they came from and supernaturally are somehow transported or walk to the corners of the earth and across oceans. But if you if you go along with this idea that they were special animals with more capabilities than average ordinary animals, then these animals, pairs of animals, then would go out from there, and they would intermix with regular ordinary animals of the same kinds, and over time they would just fizzle out. I guess you would say that they would no longer have that special capability. Sometimes you do see animals that have maybe like more of an emotional connection. I know we see that with our pets, our dogs and cats, and certain horses and so forth, whatever your pets are. So it's possible that some, animals retain that extra emotional connection and ability to sense human emotion and comfort humans and so forth. The main thing here is that they're no longer in the garden, and so they're no longer just fed automatically without a lot of work with these fruit trees that are all around. And so now God tells the Noah and his sons that they are now, I don't know if the word is allowed, but they're now given meat to eat. He does give them some rules. He says that the blood remains sacred and prohibited, and so they're not to eat that part of the animal, and that the life of an animal, including humans, belongs to God. And so if someone murders a human, this idea of protection of human life, that human bloodshed requires accountability. And this idea of humans being made in the image of God from Genesis chapter 1 remains true after the fall and after the flood. Now you have this covenant that God makes with Noah and his descendants, and it's with every living creature as well. And God promises to never again destroy the world by a flood. It could be the world or this region, but he's never going to destroy this large group of people, or you could say the Adamic line, with a flood. Of course, there's many other ways that God could destroy the earth with fire or an asteroid or a comet or something, but at least we're safe from floods now. And he does give this rainbow as a sign of the covenant. Now, I don't think that this was the very first rainbow that ever existed, but because that would mean that God somehow created new physical laws for electromagnetic light and so forth. But there was a rainbow at this point when God is given this. That's how I imagine it, when God is given this covenant. And so it becomes a sign of the covenant. First explicit post-flood covenant with the Adamic line. So this is the second covenant, but the first post-flood covenant, and it happens basically right after they get out of the ark. So the focus shifts now from judgment to preservation, and it sets the stage for humanity's renewed expansion, or the Adamic line's renewed expansion across the earth. Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 29, Ham and Noah, the first fracture. All right, so this is a weird story. There's no way of getting around it. This is just a bizarre story. I'll just read part of it. It says, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth, or over this whole region, depending on how you translate these words. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, so this is some period of time after the flood where he could actually plant a vineyard and get the grapes to grow and then process the grapes into wine. I'm not sure exactly how long that takes, but it's still some period of time after the flood. He became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned away so that they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out that what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." Okay, so he gets really upset. And so this is just this odd situation. If you just take it as literal, then, Noah's kind of passed out. He drank that much wine. He's passed out there on his bed. And Ham comes in and sees his father there and doesn't do anything about it. He just turns around and goes and tells his brothers about it. But his brothers do something about it. They walk backwards so they don't see their father's nakedness, and they cover him with a blanket. And then later on, Noah wakes up from probably has a hangover, and he finds out what his youngest son, Ham, is. That sometimes it doesn't really give the order of these sons, but here it says Ham was the youngest, and Noah is upset, very upset. So that's what this slide is talking about. Noah becomes drunk and exposed. Ham exposes his father's shame. Shem and Japheth preserve their father's honor. Noah's response suggests more than a simple glance. The exact offense remains uncertain, so we know at a minimum it was he looked at his father and didn't do anything about it. So there seems to be a gap between what was done, what Ham did, and Noah's reaction. At least from a modern perspective, we would see this as happening, and it's really more Noah's fault, right? He got drunk, so drunk that he passed out naked on his bed. It says he was in his tent, so he wasn't just, out in the open. But nevertheless, it does seem like Noah has some guilt in this. And then just the fact that Ham didn't cover him up, it just seems like there's this gap between what is said to have been done and Noah's reaction of cursing not only Ham, but he curses Canaan, who Ham is to become, this region and land of people, curses that whole line. In the Midrashic tradition, remember that's another set of Jewish writings, where they kind of fill in the blanks of what's in the scripture, and then of course the Talmud. And then I also put here in modern podcasts like Bema. So Bema is a hermeneutical podcast, very similar to my channel in terms of looking at the original Jewish language and Jewish culture and history and so forth in order to interpret the Bible. So they're similar in that respect, but they do come up with very different interpretations than I do, I think, in almost all cases. But this is the first time when I was listening to the Bema broadcast, and these are still available on their podcast channel. They posit that the offense of Ham was that he castrated his father. So he saw his father naked and exposed and passed out. And so he took that opportunity to castrate him. And that's pretty crazy if you think about it. Now, I do see that there's a gap between what was done and Noah's reaction. But to me, this takes it way too far. Certainly Noah would wake up, and you could almost die from something like that happening to you back then. But, he woke up, and let's just say he was actually castrated. He realizes that he's castrated. Yeah, he's definitely going to be upset. And is he just going to curse them? I guess the curse is pretty strong, but to me, that's even going beyond this reaction. He might even just try to kill Ham. Bema didn't come up with that. I should say that comes from some Midrashic and Talmudic traditions, and they posit that this to fill this gap, that the offense was so great that it was either castration or even sodomy. I believe this goes too far, and that the gap exists because of our cultures being different, and that their ancient culture had much more of an emphasis against dishonor and mockery of your parents. One way or another, we know that Ham is cursed, and it's not just Ham. It's not Ham that is cursed, but it's who he will become, which is this land of Canaan and the people in it. But Shem and Japheth are blessed. The Adamic line, this is where it begins to divide from within. As I've been mentioning, Ham is associated with Canaan, and Moses is traditionally the author of this text. And so Moses would have the information of where, nations would have settled and how they would have been related to Noah. And so he is either making this connection and then retrospectively saying, this is what Noah said. He didn't call him Ham, he called him Canaan. Or Noah is being prophetic, because Noah at that time, of course, would not have known, just from a human perspective, would not have known what was going to happen. And we'll see this in chapter 10 even more. This mixture of genealogy and geography, and what was known ahead of time, what was known at the time of Moses, and how would he have narrated this and have had cause to be written down, what we now read as Genesis. That brings us to chapter 10, as we get past this weirdness of Genesis chapter 9, the second half of chapter 9. So here I found online this nice family tree. It talks about Shem and Ham and Japheth. It says Shem had Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So that would be when Noah was either 602 or 603. And then these are the sons that Shem had. And it doesn't give any of these, doesn't give their ancestry, but he does give Aram's ancestry. And then he does give a lot of ancestry from Arphaxad. So this is what we see that the Bible focus narrows to the line of Shem. So the Bible focus, there's lots that goes on in the universe, lots that goes on in the earth. And so the Bible remains focused. It focuses on Adam and Eve and their line, and then now the flood. And now we're going to see that it continues to focus in on the line of Shem and his son Arphaxad. It does give some information about this particular branch of the tree, but mainly, especially when it comes to how old they were when they had them and how long they lived, we don't see that happening anymore after this Genesis chapter 10. So from Genesis chapter 2 all the way to Genesis chapter 10, that is where it gives us specific information about Adam all the way down to Abraham, or Abram, before he was renamed Abraham, how long they lived and how old they were when they had their first son, or the son that the Bible will follow. This site did some math, and it says that 892 years from Noah's birth until Abraham's birth. I didn't check that math, but probably reasonable. I would say that in terms of the timing of Genesis chapter 10, of course, it's between 9 and 11, chapters 9 and 11, but Genesis chapter 10 is sort of timeless in its nature in that it already assumes that these nations have dispersed, and so it's retrospectively looking at where these various people settled. The descendants of Noah are organized by these three sons, which as far as we know are the only three sons he had. And I should say, by the way, that was one of the things that Bema said, and I don't know if it's the Midrash as well or the Talmud, but that was the reason why Ham did it, is that he didn't want his father to have any more kids, and he just wanted it to be the three of them, and so that's why they said he did what he did. This will set the stage for the account of Babel, which is what we're just about to get to, and we see that the Bible will continue to focus on the line of Shem. I found this is an interesting image I found online. It talks about how Japheth is thought to have gone to this area of Europe, and how Ham goes to this area of Africa, and how Shem remains in this area of Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq. And then how there's also this overlap as well of all three brothers. Genesis chapter 11, why Babel happened. It talks about them going to the plains of Shinar. I should say as well that when it talks about the ancestry of Shem, This is where this term Semite comes from. I guess maybe originally it was Shemite, and maybe that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. But the H isn't there in the translation that we in modern day language, and so we just have the word Semite. And so this is the word where the word Semite comes from, and where the word anti-Semite comes from, which nowadays, if you say anything about Israel, you will be branded an anti-Semite, not an anti-Israelite, but it has to do with this idea of the ancestry of Shem. The Tower of Babel, it says in verse 1, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. Again, that's universal language. So you could say this whole region or the Adamic line had one language and one common speech. As the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And then they'd start talking about building this tower. I found online that this is where the Shinar Valley is thought to have been. So it's between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. And we know that it would be up here somewheres where Eden might have been, because that's the source of these rivers, as well as two other rivers which are no longer around in modern day times. So this is where it's thought to be, this plain of Shinar. So if they were over here and the ark ended up over here, and this region is the mountains of Ararat, then they would have come down here and settled. Now remember, God told them to spread out across the world and be fruitful and multiply. I think that most Christians, or many Christians, focus on what are secondary themes of the Babel story. So in my experiences at church and in books about the Tower of Babel, I see the focus is on human pride, ambition, self-reliance instead of God-reliance. There's also some positive things that people take out of this, is that if you are unified in your efforts, then there is much power in unity. So that's a lesson that you can extract from this story. You are unified in your purpose, then you can accomplish anything. And then I've also seen this story as this myth or explanation behind the origin of all languages on the earth. And you definitely run into some problems if you do that. Basically, you'd have to say that if it was Adam and Eve are all the humans, and all humans derived from after the flood, after Noah and his sons, then you'd say that all languages as well originate from that. And unless God supernaturally gives them all the different languages that are now spoken across the world and on various islands and so forth, then there's definitely not enough time for languages, all the different languages of the world that we have now, to evolve. If anything else, it's a secondary theme. That's not the primary theme. What is the primary theme? It is what the text emphasizes. So God commanded Noah's descendants to fill the earth. We just talked about that in Genesis chapter 9. The people feared being scattered. In 11:4, it says, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. The point of this city and this tower is to make a name for themselves, to show themselves as a strong, unified people on their own. And they, at this point, are not obeying God's command. They are trying to not only just stay in the same region, but also fortify and unify and make a city so that they can live in this area without scattering throughout the world. That's what this city and a tower is, a permanent center. And the fact that they spoke one language enabled this unified action and purpose. And so God realizes that this isn't going to work out. If they have one language, then they'll be able to accomplish this thing that they're trying to do in order to stay in this region. And so he confuses their language and disperses them. It says that in verse 8. It says, so the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So the Adamic line, which is now in the three sons of Noah, is scattered throughout the whole region or the whole world. I don't think at this point, that they went to North America or South America, but we definitely do see them very rapidly going out from this area to the areas around the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent, but into these areas of northern Turkey and Asia Minor and Iran over here and Arabia and Egypt over here, Kush. And so we see this whole area, and then they continue to expand from there throughout the centuries. We don't really have a lot of history on that other than what anthropologists have shown, because the Bible, again, follows just Shem and Arphaxad. You see that their stated goal was lest we be scattered. So that is what this text is about. That is what Babel is about. They are trying to disobey God by staying in that region. And so Babel explains the scattering that is summarized in the history that is presented in Genesis chapter 10. From this point forward, Scripture no longer tracks the whole Adamic population, but instead it follows this covenant line through Shem, and eventually we will reach Abraham. So I hope you enjoyed this today. Next week, we are going to put this all together, this Eden Adamic line theory, and propagate it forward to see what its spiritual ramifications are. I think that's really what's important about this series, is what is going on behind the scenes spiritually. I think we've definitely talked a lot about and come up with ideas and explanations for what happened physically. And we've talked a little bit about spiritual implications along the way as well. But next week we'll put it together as we end this series on the biblical flood. We'll talk about the direction that I'd like to go after this. Thanks again for tuning in and watching this video. Please like and subscribe and share with your friends, and have a great evening.